Stefan Höfler about ἀνδρειφόντης and an enigmatic title.
You're so tall.
I can sit.
Whatever you want, I think.
I might go around.
Yes.
So, my topic today is the Homeric epithet ἀνδρειφόντης and the unmetrical verse that contains it. There are actually not so many unmetrical verses in Homer, considering the sheer amount of verses in total. But this verse is actually one of the most unmetrical ones, I would say, in the Iliad. And as we will see, it's on a whole other level of unmetricality than other unmetrical verses. It appears 4 times in the Iliad in almost identical shape. So it's actually a formulaic verse, katexochen. And it reads, Meriones tatalantos enu alio ἀνδρειφόντε, which you can already hear. It's not a hexameter or not a smooth hexameter. So there is at least 1 syllable too many in the 5th foot, as you can see in the metrical analysis on your handouts. And so how are we supposed to read it? And there used to be 3 scholarly traditions in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century as to how to scan this verse in its transmitted form, so as it is here. And those schools largely reflect the scholarly traditions of the German academic tradition, the English one, and the French one. So the German tradition of the 19th century would have been to read a synesthesis of the dative singular ending and the beginning of the next word. So synesthesis is when you merge 2 vowels into 1 syllable. So enu alio ἀνδρειφόντε, but that would be an egregious synesthesis in Homer. And it's also called violent synesthesis, for example, by Leaf, or ungeheuerliche Krasis by Wackernagel, and it's also otherwise unheard of in the Iliad, so it doesn't appear anywhere else, and especially not in the formulaic verse, as Martin West points out. To crush oyan into 1 syllable would go beyond any other Homeric instance of synesthesis, and it would be especially unlikely in a formula. So the second possibility, or the second tradition, would read synesthesis of ü and a, and shortening of the dative singular ending, so enu alio ἀνδρειφόντε. But again, there was no other case of such a synesthesis. And it's also important to note that the name enu alios always scans like that in all the other instances in Homer. So again, this possibility should be ruled out. And the third, the French tradition, would have been to read, again, a synesthesis of E and O, which I call here iodization, for reasons of clarity, and again, a corruption of the dative singular ending, so enu alio ἀνδρειφόντε. And there are actually cases in Homer where we have to read such a iodization of an iota. But there are apparently only 2 cases in which such a iodization of iota occurs after a brevis and where it doesn't make position. And one of those cases is on the handouts, esti de tis proparoithe polios aipeia colone, where you have to read lios, and it doesn't lengthen the po. But this, as you can see on page 2, is actually just a variation of an almost identical verse, where polis is in the nominative singular, esti tis thrio essa polis aipeia colone. So the irregular metrical behavior of this polios is easily understandable within the concept of inflected formula. So this means that, again, this scansion of enu alio ἀνδρειφόντε would be totally unique and should be discarded. So there is no way to read the line as a hexameter at least in its transmitted form. And the problem is therefore perhaps not the name Enualios, but more probably the word ἀνδρειφόντης, or the form ἀνδρειφόντης. And this is number 2 now. And this has been the majority view for 100 years, that actually the form ἀνδρειφόντης is not the original form. And Jakob Wackernagel, for example, building on earlier scholarship, says that the first member, Andrei, of ἀνδρειφόντη, is remodeled after ἀργειφόντης, which is an epithet of Hermes in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and also in Hesiod, and it appears very often. And the idea was that this Andrei is based on ἀργειφόντης and stands for an earlier andro fontaine, for example, attested in Aeschylus, or ἀνδρειφόντης. And this andro or andra continues an earlier anr, scanning short, and therefore the form could be compared to the scansion of the very famous Homeric words androteta, abrotaxumen, abrote, and so on, that have to be scanned as 2 shorts. A couple of decades later, after the decipherment of Mycenaean, Hugo Mühlestein was the first one to compare Mycenaean anno quota, which is a male personal name, to represent an anor quontas, which would go back to anor quontas and would therefore be the etymological, the cognate of ἀνδρειφόντης or ἀνδρειφόντης. And he points out that since Mycenaean already shows a development of syllabic R to arra or orro, he thinks that the verses containing ἀνδρειφόντης and androteta and other formulae are in essence pre-Mycenaean, and so is the hexameter. And so the claim is that the originator of the formula actually said enu alio janr quontai, which would be a nice hexameter end. So this idea has actually found many followers, and I think it can be considered the communis opinion nowadays. You see a number of different quotes on your handouts. I will not go through them. Interesting to note, number 4. So people have even tried to reconstruct the whole hexameter line in pre-Mycenaean, mer ionas atalantos enu alioi anor quontai, which of course reads as a perfect hexameter. And it's also fascinating, of course, to be able to reconstruct such an ancient piece of poetry. But also, such a view has raised several objections, and that's under point 2.3, because projecting the whole verse back into pre-Mycenaean implies that the dactylic hexameter also needs to be projected into pre-Mycenaean, and we would have to assume that it had remained unchanged for 800 years or so of oral tradition prior to Homer, which of course is not an impossible hypothesis, but it's kind of costly if the only thing that it relies on is the explanation of this unmetrical behavior, or this irregular metrical behavior, which is a sort of circular argument. Another point is that even though the name Enualios is scanned with a long U in all the Homeric instances, some commentators have actually proposed or think that Enualios actually reflects metrical lengthening of Enualios with a sequence of only shorts, because the name is, for example, so scanned in a lyric fragment. And in this case, not only the hexameter itself, but also the concept of metrical lengthening in this name would have to be projected into pre-Mycenaean, which again is a costly hypothesis. But even if we assume that the hexameter, and I won't go into any theory on the origin of the hexameter here, even if you assume that the hexameter itself is pre-Mycenaean, and that the verse was forged when syllabic R was still syllabic, we would have to accept the idea that after the probably pre-Mycenaean vocalization of syllabic R, dozens of generations would have transmitted an unmetrical verse, over a period of almost 800 years. So a very different strategy was therefore proposed by a number of people who claim that the verse actually has a recent origin. I'm not sure whether they really claim that the whole verse or the formulaic material or the awkward scansion has a recent origin. But for example, Dag Haug in his book says il nous semble alors préférable de considérer ce vers comme très récent. Yeah. But again, such a view, at least in a very radical interpretation, fails to recognize the obvious formulaic nature of the verse, and it doesn't explain the metrical behavior. So let's move to page number 4. So how do we explain the form ἀνδρειφόντης? As far as I know, all scholars agree that ἀνδρειφόντης is a remodeling of ἀνδροφόντης or ἀνδρειφόντης, and there's also consensus that the model for the reshaping of ἀνδροφόντε is the epithet ἀργειφόντης, which is a strange epithet, deserves a book on its own. And it appears 30 times in Homer and Hesiod, and always verse finally. So very explicitly, for example, Eva Tichy and also Lucien van Beek referred to the dative that is found in Beta 103, diactor ἀργειφόντη, as the template on which this ἀνδροφόντε, or an earlier ἀνδροκόνtai, was remodeled to ἀνδρειφόντη. But this verse final formula has actually a different metrical structure, and ἀργειφόντη is also in a different metrical slot than this would be ἀνδροφόντε or ἀνδρειφόντη. So I think it's kind of difficult to argue that a poet would have come up with this remodeling of something like ἀνδροφόντε to ἀνδρειφόντη. And most importantly, and this is true for all the other accounts that I've presented so far, it leaves the fundamental question unanswered. And the fundamental question, I think, is what was so wrong about εννου αλλιώ ἀνδροφόντε with a perspicuous first compound member that is also attested in other words in Homer, and a scansion that is licensed by and similar to verses containing androteta and so on, for the poet to really undertake a disfiguration of this ἀνδροφόντε to an otherwise completely awkward and unparalleled scansion of εννου αλλιώ ἀνδρειφόντη. So in other words, I don't think that a verse like Meriones atalantos εννου αλλιώ ἀνδροφόντε, if this actually was the original verse at some point, I don't think that this would have been more suspicious or less suspicious than, for example, hon pot mongo osa lipus androteta kaheben, which is attested in our text. So I'm not sure why one would have had to have used that. So I think the answer can only be that actually the verse never contained ἀνδροφόντε, but at the same time that Homer actually never sang this εννου αλλιώ ἀνδρειφόντη, because even though Homer sleeps sometimes, I don't think that he would have overslept this verse. And I also think that the origin of this ἀνδρειφόντη has to lie in an error of the written transmission of the text, because I think only a scribe that was not so aware of metrics could have deformed such a form. But what was the original form X? So the remodeling of this original form to ἀνδρειφόντη, I think, only makes sense if this X had not been ἀνδροφόντε, but rather something that was even weirder than the wrongfully produced ἀνδρειφόντη, but at the same time something that was close enough to the metrically inequivalent ἀργειφόντης for this original form to be remodeled after this ἀργειφόντης and not after other compounds in andro, like androphonos and so on. So as it turns out, page number 5, the best candidate for this original form X is a form with the first compound member in E, as ἀνδρειφόντη or ἀδρειφόντη, to which we will return below. And ἀνδρειφόντη is actually attested in a number of manuscripts and papyri. So I copied the critical apparatus of both Allen's and Ludwig's editions on your handouts, where you can see that the variant is actually very well attested. And the variant has also been duly acknowledged by people like Chantraine, Latach, Tichy, and also Van Beek, but it is mostly ignored otherwise. And it's, for example, not found in the editions by West and Van Til. The interpretation that this ἀνδρειφόντη actually just represents an idacystic or iodacistic spelling of ἀνδρειφόντη, as proposed by Eva Tichy, is unpromising. Because first, we would expect such an iodacistic spelling of a former A as E only in words that were either part of the personal vernacular of the scribe or where different derivatives would encourage analogy. But this is not the case with ἀνδρειφόντης. Second, we would expect an iodacistic spelling only in manuscripts, or predominantly in the manuscripts that also exhibit iodacistic spellings in other words too. So I looked into two manuscripts that have ἀνδρειφόντε, and they actually do not have any other iocistic spellings, at least in the pages that I looked at. Of course, I didn't look at the whole text. But you can see here, the first manuscript is Escorial Y11, that has ἀνδρειφόντε here. A second hand corrected that to ἀνδρειφόντε. You can see that this is clearly secondary because epsilon iota would have been written with a ligature. And the second manuscript is Geneva Bibliothèque Publique 44. You can also see Enualio ἀνδρειφόντε very clearly. The crucial point is that those two manuscripts and all the other manuscripts that have a reading ἀνδρειφόντε do not have a reading ἀργειφόντες. So again, you see the two manuscripts here where they have ἀργειφόντε, and the A is written with a ligature. So page number 6 now. Despite the alleged parallelism of the two epithets, it is, I guess, clear that whatever led to the spelling ἀνδρειφόντε did not lead to a spelling ἀργειφόντες. So I think it is more plausible that a certain manuscript tradition had ἀνδρειφόντε, preserved in ἀνδρειφόντε, but at the same time had ἀργειφόντες. So in addition to that, we also know that ἀνδρειφόντε was a reading known to Eustathius, because he says in his commentary that the word ἀνδρειφόντες has two spellings. Probably also known to the authors of the Etymologicum Magnum, and it is found on a papyrus from the 1st century. I wasn't able to look at this papyrus because it's not accessible. So I think the reading ἀνδρειφόντε is both the forma and the lectio difficilior. And in my opinion, the best way and the only way, I think, to explain a transformation of this Enualio ἀνδρειφόντε to Enualio ἀνδρειφόντε is within the written tradition. Either that a scribe just amended an ἀνδρειφόντε, which he didn't understand because the first compound member was totally unintelligible to him, to ἀνδρειφόντε because he knew there was an ἀργειφόντες, which he probably interpreted as layer of Argus, and then he formed this ἀνδρειφόντες layer of men. There's also a more sophisticated scenario, but I won't go through that now. So I think this led to the majority of manuscripts that have both ἀργειφόντες and ἀνδρειφόντε. But a more conservative tradition could be seen in the manuscripts like the ones that I showed you, that at least partly have ἀργειφόντες, but an unremodeled ἀνδρειφόντε. But what is this ἀνδρειφόντε? It is clear that ἀνδρειφόντε still should scan as long short. And it's also clear that an ἀνδρειφόντε could never have continued a form with a syllabic R. So no ἀνδρειφόνται or whatever. So it would have never scanned as such as short initially. So we are virtually obliged to assume that ἀνδρειφόνται continues an earlier, metrically entirely unobtrusive ἀνδρειφόνται, and the scansion of which would have been totally similar or totally parallel to Aphrodite, which is found 29 times in verse final position in the Iliad. And actually this form ἀνδρειφόνται is a form that was long ago proposed by some scholars, Munro, for example, or Leaf and Latach. So this ἀνδρειφόνται that we arrived at on internal grounds was probably remade into ἀνδρειφόνται, I think, based on a folk etymological connection to its alleged meaning, slayer of men. But what is this ādri of ἀνδρειφόνται? And now we arrive at the last page. So it could be that ἀνδρειφόνται is actually an old epithet, an inherited epithet with the meaning smasher of the rock, whose first compound member, ādri, could be the cognate of Vedic ādri, which has the meaning stone rock, from ntri, the unsplittable one. And incidentally, this ādri is used in the Rig Veda for the rock that was smashed by Indra or Brihaspati, as in the passage that you can see on the handouts. And there's also a compound with ādri as the first member, ādripid, splitting of the rock, which is said of Brihaspati, and in later lexicographical literature, it is an epithet of Indra. So is it possible that Greek ānδρειφόντες is the functional and etymological equivalent of Vedic ādripid, and therefore the Greek reflex of an inherited mythological motive of hero plus rock plus mash. Of course, the second member does not match, etymologically at least, but this does not really surprise us, since the continuance of the root paid in Greek actually developed into a very different semantic direction, where phaedomai does not mean to split or to destroy, but rather the opposite, so to not destroy, to spare. So the substitution of the second compound member would, in that scenario, not be surprising. So if Greek ἀνδρειφόντης continues an archaic compound that was embedded in the inherited Dichtersprache, we would have to assume that its meaning had become obscure, and that folk etymology then led to the reinterpretation and also the awkward remodeling of ἀνδρειφόντης and then ἀνδρειφόντης. So the last point on the handout is then the question about ennualios. What is this figure? I have no idea, to admit. It's the only figure that is referred to as ἀνδρειφόντης in Homer. So the question here is it possible to assume that this is some sort of a Greek avatar of Indra or Brihaspati? I'm not sure, and there's a scenario here. There's no agreement on the etymology of ennualios, and it's not even certain that it's a Greek name, if you trust a forthcoming paper by Jakubowicz. So my more cautious interpretation in number 8 would be that the war god ennualios only secondarily and perhaps only coincidentally adopted this inherited heroic epithet of ἀνδρειφόντης, the meaning of which was no longer understood. So my conclusion for today is that I think that our verse should be restored as meriones atalantos ennualio ἀνδρειφόντε, and with that I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for your nice paper. And we have 2-3 hands. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan, for a very clear presentation, as always, I think. I have some comments and a question. My comment also concerns what I wrote on this myself, because you share me under the people who can be criticized by saying that the verse must have been 800 years old. I think I completely agree with the fact that it's not pre-Mycenaean, as you also put on the handout. So it might be more recent. So I think actually what I wrote about the reconstruction ἀνδρειφόντης in my dissertation also solves that problem. And that's also connected with the problem of muta cum liquida in Homer. And that's what my next question is about. So if you assume that ἀνδρειφόντης, with the word for rock, is old, you must assume that at a very early stage, this word internal muta cum liquida scansion was possible. And Aphrodite is of course one of the problems, and even Eva Tichy, I think, admits that it was not originally admitted word internally. So what would you do with it?
So I would thank you for your question. Actually, I had a more extensive treatment of your views on the handouts, but I had to shorten it. I think that your idea that the scansion of the verse or the verse itself is only, let's say, 400 years prior to Homer.
Yeah, well, it's
an estimate. But it's a nice solution to somehow go beyond or go around the problem of this transmission of 800 years of this unmetrical verse. So that is probably a possible solution, though I'm not sure whether, again, this ἀνδρειφόντης would have ever been remade into an ἀνδρειφόντης, which doesn't make sense.
I agree.
So that's the question. I think that's the problem with all accounts. It's not the 800 years or 400 years or whatever. It's just the reason why they did that. With Aphrodite, I think that, I mean, there you have to somehow accept that there were words that just had to go into the hexameter or any preceding meter of that, and that they would just have accepted some scansion of muta cum liquida as not so egregious than other things. So I don't know. I cannot really believe that Aphrodite would have been left out of
May I
poetry
probably
just because
give
of
my
her
opinion
name.
now on Aphrodite? So I think it must have contained syllabic R, and there is an etymology by Wiczak, which connects this with the particle afar and the word for shining.
Yeah,
the word for
I
shining.
think that's possible. I think that's
It
possible.
would be
But again, that's not
Yeah.
the actual problem with ἀνδρειφόντη. So it's,
Yeah.
but you're right. You're right. So
Yeah, thank you very much. And for the, the connection with the Vedic. Oh, thank you very much. I mean, especially for the connection with the Vedic material. For me, I just couldn't understand something. It's something puzzling for me, because you reconstruct you reconstruct the ἀνδρειφόντη back to ἀνδρειφόντη. So you have the scansion, short, long, and then it is, it is okay in hexameter, and then so it's kind of a remodeling of the ānδρη to ānδρη to people, and then it creates a very unmetrical phrase, and then according to your evidence that this phrase only occurs at the end of the verse. So the original short, long is metrical and can be put everywhere in the hexameter. But then the Greek people turn it into an unmetrical thing, and they certainly got uncomfortable with this unmetrical thing. But why do they put at the end? Not if it is unmetrical, why at the end? Yeah, if it is unmetrical, I can put it everywhere. Why at the end? But originally, it is metrical and it can be everywhere. But if you turn it into an unmetrical thing, for example, the short, long, for example, it is metrical, and in the original hexameter, I can put it in the first, not first, second, third para.
Yeah.
And then if you turn it into an unmetrical thing, you just turned ānδρη to ānδρη. But why should the Greek people move all the unmetrical things at the end? So this is kind of puzzling thing for me.
That's an interesting thought. That's an interesting thought. I cannot explain why what happened in the minds of Greek poets, but I think it's an interesting thought. But in my theory, the unmetricality would not have been produced by a Greek poet at all. It would have been just produced by a Greek scribe. I think that's the difference.
Because I just have the idea. Because you quoted Eva Tichy in 2010, but I couldn't find because I couldn't find the exact position. But according to the theory of Tichy, that hexameter was not so old.
Yeah.
And actually, I can explain this ἀνδρειφόντης using the combination of the so-called choiambic dimeter second plus dialectic variant, namely the 8 plus 7, and then for very end, it is like uncaps, long, short uncaps. So it matches only for this variant, the so-called 8 plus 7 variant.
So I have to admit I have no bets and no own theory on the origin of the hexameter. I'm completely in no camp there.
My own concern.
Yeah. But thank you for your opinion.
Ricardo?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Just a quick remark about the final ānδρη element. Chiarabuzzone tried to explain ἀνδροτέτα, which is also unmetrical, ἀνδροτέτα, which is also unmetrical and everything, as originally reflecting ἀνδροτέτα from adros.
From hadros?
Adros, from Greek, which means green, secus, I think. It's an adjective, meaning green. So maybe.
Hadros,
so,
No.
Great favor, but maybe at the end, there's also this possibility that instead of being rough, it could be this adros.
But you could not explain hadri in that, right? If hadros is from sadro, then would not make sense. But that's another question. So actually, hadroteta would be a perfect form, morphologically at least. It would explain the fact that forms in tes are actually only derived from adjectives and not from substantives, as ἀνδρειφόντης seems to be. And also there are readings ἀνδρειφόντης in manuscripts, so so it's actually grounded within the manuscript tradition. So I wouldn't bet on anything, but I think that ἀνδρειφόντης should be a reading that needs to be taken seriously. So I would be glad for this reference.
I'll give you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Angelo?
Thank you very much, Stefan. Are you familiar with the paper by Olivier Wachter on Persephone? The name of
Yes.
Persephone?
Yeah.
That would help you with the second member of the compound. No?
Probably. So the second member is even more obscure than the first member, I would say. And that's but yeah, it's Fontes is completely irregular in terms of Greek historical morphology. So it's the whole.
Right, but it's a folk etymology in Persephone.
Yeah.
It's a folk etymology for the second member here.
Yeah. But thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I regret I give myself the word for a couple of minutes. And I would, a couple of remarks. I appreciate, obviously, how ingenious and insightful is your proposal. But I must confess from the beginning, I remain gladly by and further. So I would say the fact is that ἀνδρειφόντης fits perfectly into the personality of Enyalios. Absolutely. So Enyalios is not a splitter of rocks. It is a killer of men. In other words, if one applies the same prejudices or strictures you have shown against this, you have infinitely more strictures against the explanation at semantic level from the adri, splitting. As far as I know, you should have to demonstrate that Atheno is also a split, and I think that this will not be possible. That is the point. On the other hand, I would say that the criticism based in page 3. They are too far-fetched, and now the fact that one assumes the existence of a former ἀνδρειφόντης, we think of Mycenaean ano, García, and ano quota, and so on. This is the form of facilissima. So this does not imply that we admit the existence of an hexameter at this time. It is only about this form. And with all my admiration for Ricardo and for you, also I have many of us, we have immediately thought of ἀνδρειφόντητα kai heaven and so on. The best and simplest manner to put both together is to admit ἀνδρ for both. This is the point, Also, obviously, this offer the face for several attacks, but semantically it fits perfectly, and and formally it fits too. In other words, if you go further with your point, please have a try to demonstrate that the person Enyalios is a splitter of rocks. And my last point is, I would suggest let away Enyalios because it's a problem without a clear solution.
That's true.
So thank you.
Just to quickly pick up on the semantic thing. So under my theory, at least, the poets would not have thought of ἀνδρειφόντης or ἀνδρειφόντης as the splitter of rock anymore. They would have already done the full etymological.
It's clear.
At least that's what I would have to assume.
But
yeah.
you understand. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, and we come to the end of our session. Colleague Hansen, more than welcome. About Hecate and paradox.
Thank you. Well, Thank you, Professor García Ramón. Thank you. And thank you, Laura, for letting me speak here. This is my talk is, as you said, about Hecate and her dogs. So we're going to see a little about Hecate. The reason why I came up with a new etymology for Hecate, that's what this talk's going to be about, is that I sat attending the Root of Europe summer school back in 2015 and attended a talk by David Anthony on these midwinter solstice dog sacrifices. Then he mentioned this connection and I thought, well, why not? So let's see. So as it is now, we have three prevalent existing etymologies of Hecate. One states that her name is of a pre-Greek, or more specifically maybe Carian origin. Another states that it's an abbreviated form of the epithet Hecate bolos, shooting from afar or striking with hundreds, according to the ancients at least. This is not an epithet for Hecate, but more likely of Apollo. We see that a lot of times in the Homeric epics and other places. Or the third etymology would be she who works her will, with the Hec part of the word coming from or harking back to Proto-Indo-European wish. I would like to propose a fourth etymology, a new etymology based on her appearance with dogs. So I would like to propose an etymology something along the lines of Proto-Indo-European's Swikrimtach, meaning possessing her own dogs, or she possesses her own dogs. So I'll get back to why I would do that in a little while. But now let's first take a look at the structure of the talk. I'll begin by going through the existing etymologies into a little more detail, then turning to who Hecate actually is, and if that fits with the original existing etymologies, and then trying to make this new etymology. So, the existing etymologies. So the first etymology we should consider here, the first of the original ones or the old ones, is that her name is of pre-Greek, or more specifically maybe Carian origin. Pre-Greek could also mean the association with the Egyptian frog goddess Hecate, the goddess of fertility and childbirth, but I'll leave that out here. The origin, or the pre-Greek origin, or non-Greek origin, most often associated with the name would be a Carian one, as mentioned here by Bekes, Kraus, and Nilsson. And they, in turn, based themselves on Wilhelmovitz Müllendorf's claim that she was of Anatolian origin and was subsequently adopted by the Greeks, and her name was adopted to the known Apollonian epithets Hecate bolos or Hecate bolos, like we see here, an Apollonian epithet Hecate bolo Apollonos, of Apollo who strikes from afar. Now, a second etymology, as I have already mentioned, is that her name would be an abbreviated form of the epithet Hecate bolos, meaning shooting from afar or striking with hundreds, as per the ancient Greeks. The starting point here in this ancient etymology would be either shooting from afar, that is a derivation of some kind to hekas, afar, far off, or maybe striking with hundreds to hecaton, 100, as also mentioned by Wackernader. Okay, so this would then be, it's suggested, abbreviated to Hecate bolos and to Hecatos, which are also Apollonian epithets, and the latter has, of course, Hecate as its feminine. So here we would have the name it suggests. The third etymology would be she who works her will, with Hec harking back to Proto-Indo-European wish. This etymology is mentioned by Plowitz in his etymological dictionary and repeated again by Liddell and Scott in their large Greek dictionary. So here further reference is made to Hecate bolos as hitting the mark at will, and Hecate bolos striking at will. And there might be something to this understanding, maybe not of Hecate, but of at least Hecate bolos and Hecate bolos, or the Hec part of it, if we take into account what Laura has written in her thesis about the comparison of the Vedic, it's from the second book of the Rig Veda, Vashti tat Ashnoti Dhanvana, mit seinem Bogen trifft dahin, wohin will. So we have this shooting or hitting whoever, wherever, whatever you want. So there might be something there. But again, that's an etymology of Hecate bolos, etc., not necessarily of Hecate herself. So yeah, here you have the Greek counterpart. To be fair, we also have, you could say, a modification of either etymology 2 or 3. That's the one mentioned by Frisk in his etymological dictionary. It states that both Hekatos and Hecate are seen as abbreviations of Hecate bolos, only that. And then Hecate bolos would be a secondary hybrid of these. So again, it's just a different way of seeing the relationship internally between these forms, right? Not necessarily a new etymology per se. So, but now we have seen the existing etymologies. So now let's take a look at who Hecate actually was or is. Do any of these three etymologies actually fit with what we know about Hecate? And yes, some of it may, some of it may not. Let's take a look. We'll start by looking at her origin or her place of worship. If we follow Ilmo Robert von Rudloff, there were a lot, he has gone through all of the material about her, and he has noted that there were a lot of places of worship, among which Athens, Aegina, Sicily, Samothrace, Thrace, etc. But we won't concentrate on those here. We would rather concentrate on this claim that she was of Anatolian or Carian origin that has already been mentioned in one of the pre-Greek, the first etymology, right? So let's see if she could be that. There are some indications of a Carian or general Anatolian origin. These are mentioned and listed by Krause and Nielsen, among others. We have, for instance, or Hecatomnus, and these names are primarily found in Caria during the 5th and 4th century BC. So here is one indication. Also, we have the very famous temple of Hecate at Lagina in Caria, this part of the Stratonicaean municipality, so to say, the Stratonicaean area. So there was a large cult of Hecate in that area. So far, it seems that Caria or Anatolia is not that far-fetched after all. We don't find Hecate mentioned in the Homeric epics. And it has been mentioned by Berg, who actually does not support the Anatolian origin of her, that we have some typically Carian, so to say, attributes of her in Hesiod's Theogony. So, but again, was that because of Hesiod's own origin? Well, it's hard to say. At least if we follow this line of thoughts, we could say that a possible explanation of her origins could be that her cult was introduced to the Greek mainland from Asia Minor in the Archaic period, and then we would have had contamination with witches and demons that eroded and infernalized her Olympian stature, transforming her finally into the Hecate known from later traditions. This is the viewpoint of Krause and Nielsen. All right, but there are also indications against a Carian or general Anatolian origin. First of all, as von Rudloff mentions, there are indeed numerous monuments to Hecate in Phrygia and Caria. That's true, but they are quite of a quite late date. They date around the 1st century BC in the Roman era in the area. Also, it is mentioned by von Rudloff, all of these theophoric personal names from Hecate, they may actually belong to the Apollonian part of it, because Apollo was also strong in the area, for instance, Hecatos Nessos there. To continue, we know that Hecate was worshipped as a fully independent deity at Aegina and Athens, for instance. We know, if it's true at least from Aristophanes, that a Hecataean stood before every house in Athens. And we see numerous references to Hecate in Attic drama. William Berg even goes so far as to suggest that in the Mycenaean Epimedea, we might actually find a Hecatian by name or some association to her here. So it might, she might even be of Mycenaean origin, that is definitely not Anatolian but Greek. If that's true, I can't tell. But indeed, there seems to be evidence against an Anatolian origin of her too. So turning now to her relation to other deities, because it seems that Hecate is a goddess whom we really can't place in a fixed box. She's a little everything. Let's start by her relation to Demeter and Persephone. She's mentioned as an attendant of Persephone, and we know that altars and sanctuaries are found just outside the entrance to sanctuaries of Demeter and Persephone. So there is some kind of early connection here, early association here. But the most intriguing and most profound association, well, even confusion or total identification, is not with Demeter or Persephone, but with Artemis. We know, for instance, that the name of Hecate is also used for Artemis, and of course we have already seen that Hekatos is an epithet of Apollo, which is, or who is again closely connected to Artemis, right? We know from Aeschylus that Artemis Hecate was a protector of women and labor. Farnell mentions that Hecate as a guardian aspect of Artemis. Nilsson claims that Hecate represented the dark or chthonic side of Artemis. And when we come to Hellenistic times, we actually see a very great level of confusion between these two deities, these two goddesses. So there's a very profound association here, more than association, more like confusion or total similar identity of them. There is a problem though, namely that we rarely see Hecate as a guardian figure at entrances to sanctuaries and temples of Artemis, and at least according to von Rudloff, I'm not sure that he's right here, but we never see her with a bow. And if there's something we see with both Apollo and Artemis, it's a bow, right? So could the consequence be here that the association of Hecate's name to the epithets Hecate-bolos and Heke-bolos, that both involve shooting, is not as straightforward as it's often claimed? I mean, if we really don't see her, at least not that much, with a bow, could it be then that the bolos part of Hecate-bolos, the shooting part, really has nothing to do with the first part, Hecate, that they are actually to be kept apart somehow? Now, she's also associated with Apollo, as I've already mentioned. Again, both Apollo and Artemis are seen as archers and bringers of sudden disease and death, and this thing about death at least also has something to do with Hecate, as I'll return to a little later. She's associated with quite many gods and goddesses and deities in general, so I won't go into all of them here, because the most important mixture here or confusion is that with Artemis and Apollo, at least to the etymology. Von Rudloff tries to sum up or to discuss and conclude that the reason why we have all of these confusions and associations might be that Hecate's roles are that she's subservient to other more prominent deities. So more or less irrespective of who those deities are, dependent on the place of worship, etc. But what we see in general is, in particular, that she is associated with the entranceway figures and being an attendant of other deities, right? Lastly, I could mention that in very late times we have a conflation with the figure of Diana, the moon goddess, but that's much later. So, moving on now to her functions, then we see we see at least 5 main functions of her. That of Propylaea, the entranceway guardian, the one averting evil. And by extension, it has been argued that this doesn't only go on doorways, pathways, entrances, etc., gates, but also realms outside or beyond the world of the living. That'll move us to the chthonic part that comes later, right? We also see her as the Kurotrophos, the nurse of children, or the birth goddess, so to speak. We have some, but the pre-Roman references to Hecate as a birth goddess are quite rare. We see here that in this function she's associated with torches and dogs. So I'll return to that a little later, what these dogs might mean here. Yeah. She's also a propolos, an attendant, guide and companion, just as she's a phosphoros, a light bringer or a light bearer. And lastly, the main function here of her is that of Chthoniya, the goddess of the earth or the underworld. That might be her most salient or most well-known attribute, but it's actually quite late. We see it only from the second half of the 5th century that she's associated with the restless spirits and phantasms, etc. But in this role, regardless of how late it is, we see purification ceremonies involving the killing of dogs and offerings of food left at crossroads at every new moon. And about crossroads, specifically 3-way intersections, she is quite important. Here we have again the entranceway, we have this in-between, in a way, guardian. Also, about 3, she's 3-formed, or at least she becomes 3-formed. In the earliest times, she's not. She's only single-formed there. But she's quite often depicted with 1 dog head, 1 serpent head, 1 horse head, or just as 3 persons. And then what is it about dogs? Dogs are closely associated with the underworld, as we know from Othros and from Cerberus, but that might not be her dogs here. Well, I'll return to that. About the dogs, dogs also strongly associated with Artemis, specifically in her role of hunting companions. It might be, therefore, it has been suggested at least, that the dogs have served 2 distinct roles. They could have been as companions, as we see with Artemis maybe, and as impure animals suitable for purification ceremonies, associated here maybe with Hecate, and this goes both with her Kurotrophos function and her Chthoniya function, of course. She's also often depicted with gods, for instance, together with Hermes or Cybele in reliefs and so on. So, and then she's associated with snakes, magic, etc. We know that, the goddess of magic. But that's again quite late. So what can we learn from this? Well, we can learn, if we want to make a new etymology, yes, that... Yes, I'm aware of time. Yeah.
No, I am so interested that I have looked now. I didn't look.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
No, don't be. Well, I'm glad. So we can see here as a starting point that her origin may not be Anatolian, but Greek. She's not necessarily identical to or related to the Apollonian and Artemision epithets Hecatos, Hecate, Hecatebolos, Hecatebolos, and Hecate Beletes, which is also attested. So mainly because she is, I wouldn't say never depicted with a bow, but rarely, because actually we have a bow there, right? So I'm not sure that von Rudolph is right there. But that, of course, might also be a depiction of Artemis. It's not that certain. So, but dogs she had, and I'm not the only one who has noticed that. Actually, I've named my talk after the French novel Hecate et ses chiens, Hecate and her dogs. Quite interesting novel. Well, never mind that. So I would like to propose an etymology based on her appearance with dogs. And that etymology is, as I've already stated, Hecate, that is frequently possessing her own dogs. So the dog part we might understand, she's there, but why her own or separate? Well, I'm not sure. It might be that we just want to separate them from other hellhound dogs like Cerberus or Orthros. It might also be that the truth is found in the metamorphosis myth in the Lycophron, where we have a friendly-looking female dog accompanying Hecate that was originally the Trojan queen Hecate, who leapt into the sea after the fall of Troy and was transferred by Hecate into her familiar. That might also be a reason for the sway part. It's her own dog. I'm not sure about that. But I'm sure about one thing, actually two things. We have two problems with this analysis, but formally. The first problem is, why do we have q not yielding p, but k? Normally q would yield p, like in hippos, but it doesn't do so here. I think we might find the explanation in the Bucola's rule, stating that a labiovelar stop dissimulates to an ordinary velar stop next to the vowel u or its corresponding glide w, as in Bucola's, Welsh, Beagle, etc. It's not the exact same thing we see here, because it's not a labiovelar stop, and it's not a w or u just next to the qu, but it's sort of similar. If we have a w here and something almost similar to qu here, then it's not that far-fetched, I believe, to assume distant assimilation, removal of the last w. Then we would have Switchentach. The second problem is the presence of the t in the word for dog. But is that a problem? Normally, the paradigm for dog is reconstructed as kvon kunos. But as Birgit Olsen has shown at several occasions, in several papers, we have some kind of conglomerate or complex of VIE, NT, and N. They were perhaps originally conditioned variants of the same derivational suffix. So it might be actually that the T would be expected in kvnt, that would actually be the underlying form of dog. And we see the T actually in Proto-Germanic hunda and Latvian suntana, large dog. So there is some evidence for a T here. But there is a new problem, namely that the expected development of the NT in this kind of phonological surrounding would be loss of N according to Olsen. So we would expect like kurunto, yielding kurto, we would expect more like not kvnt, but kut. We would expect kutach or kutach rather than kvntach. I would suggest that we could solve this problem by revocalizing an old kvntach, which actually doesn't follow the normal syllabification rules of Proto-Indo-European. We could revocalize it from kvntach to kvntach. And then when we have kvntach following the normal rules, then we could have this dissimulation rule, the Bucola's-like rule I mentioned before. So this might be the explanation of the Hecate etymology. So I'm afraid I won't have time to sum up. I hope you remember most of what I have said. At least we have a couple of previous etymologies, but they build on her being Carian. She is not. And it builds on association with Artemis and Apollo, at least with Hecatopolis, etc. But it's not sure that they can be that easily associated, at least not with the bow. So I have proposed a new etymology based on her appearance with dogs. So that would be it from me. Thank you for listening. I hope you have some questions or comments to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your extremely interesting, insightful paper. We have questions, Laura?
Yeah, just a reference suggestion for
Yes.
your for this association between dogs and magic, because I mean it's nothing. Maybe could be useful for your point. There is a paper by Christopher Faraone called Hephaestus the Magician, Parallels for Alkino's Watchdogs. And actually, if I remember it correctly, I read it a long time ago, so now I tried to eyeball why you were speaking. The point is that this special dogs created by Hephaestus, or Hephaestus creating these special dogs, rely upon parallel which is sort of prerogative of magicians, and Faraone provides some examples in the Hansen actually not in the European tradition, but this could maybe explain like in a syncretic way the association between Hecate and magic. I don't know, but it could be useful for you. So
Yeah, thank you. I'll look it up.
Send you
Yeah, please do. If you have it as a PDF, it would be really nice. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so it's indeed very interesting. I wouldn't say I'm completely convinced by the etymology. So to my mind, it's
neither am I necessarily.
Hecate or Hecate. But yeah, so the I would say something about a carrier connection. I always had sort of the the impression that yes, the name Hecataios is especially popular in Syrian. So now I checked out, yes, so in lexicon of Greek personal names in the volumes I have. So in Korea it was indeed extremely popular. So you've got like 170 tags on Hecataios, which so one gets an impression that so every second person in Korea wanted to be called Hecataios.
Exactly.
And
but quite late attestations again.
Yeah, it's everything. Yeah, so going from 5th century BC until Roman times.
Yes.
Also quite a lot in Ionia, and so in other parts of Asia Minor. I do not have many volumes for other part of Greece. Yeah, but for example in Thessaly or Megara, so you've got 2 attestations. So 2 tags, it's nothing at all. You know? Right. This one point. I mean, so in generally, I would say that if you want to trace the so to say the cult, at least cult, so in its reality, so the personal names would be a very important thing. Yeah, and partly interconnected. So there is actually an attestation of Carian name Hekatomnos in native Carian inscriptions. In at least in one in Sinuri. So you've got indeed it's written in Katomna. Well, it's finally disproves nothing, but it's interesting
it adds
way
to
so to see. And Diego, he thinks that so the second part can be compared with the word Menor, which we have in Karen, which probably means son, or it's something like descendant might be. So if you would be able to to prove or disprove Karen etymology of the name, so it would add something definitely.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Just a very short remark. I think if you want to make this etymology work, you could also assume that the T belongs to the suffix. So it's a possessive suffix in Greek, right? So who has her own dogs, like in an-o-watos, stuff like that, right? So that would make it more easy, I think.
Oh, excuse me. Sorry.
Thank you. I was just thinking of a detail in your presentation where you refer to sacrificial offerings of dogs.
Yes.
At
crossroads and around the moon especially.
I'm not sure exactly what terminologies it's being used in these contexts, but I think it's apparent in other cases that when dogs are ritually killed in ancient India and also in ancient Greece. This is not an act perceived as a sacrificial act, but a ritual killing of a dog, ∞ and this is also something we discussed earlier in connection to the Ashramita. The ritual killing is not a sacrificial killing necessarily. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So the root Gwen would never be used in a sacrificial context. So I think that might be important.
Well, what's the difference
Because
between the ritual?
Gwen means to slay an animal.
No. What's the difference between the ritual killing and the sacrificial killing?
Because Tusia, the ritual slaughter of a legitimate killing, and in a way of a domesticated animal, is I think has a very different context. If you look at the Bolfoneia, the festival of the Dikuleia, where an ox or a cow is killed ritually, it's a ritual very different from a traditional animal sacrifice. It's the ritualization of an illegitimate killing of an animal. Yeah. And in the case of the dog, perhaps the ritualization of killing of an enemy, or something like that.
I'm still not clear, but okay.
No,
Thank you.
Well, I speak the last one.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your approach. I find that the approach is the good one, actually, and you have been able to eliminate some possibilities in view of the characteristics of the characteristic features of the goddess. Yeah, and then we can believe that the connection with the dogs is at least one of the most plausible. This is clear. Yeah.
Is it at least a plausible one? Maybe.
Yeah. There are others too, but this is very, very clear. Yeah, and this fits with the image and so on. Yeah. Apart from this, I don't say. I would say no connection with Wikipedia. Yeah, this is I'm not sure. Okay, far-fetched. Yeah. Well, but the problem is, first of all, as you are surely aware of, is the problem with the wows, yeah, with the elimination of the wows as you have proposed.
Yeah.
Perhaps you should have a try to make a clear justification of this. You can imagine that this awakes some structures. Yeah? My problems could be in the case of the formation. If you assume a compound in the terms you do, you have to explain why do you create a motion, a feminine motion there for the compound.
Yeah.
Perhaps because it's a name. This could be a possibility, but I would prefer Lucian's explanation in terms of tota. Then you have it easier than to assume that to a compound you get a motion. Yeah, you can invoke this a proper name, but
personally, I just see it as an adjective substantivized in the feminine due to the goddess's feminine character.
But if you are operating with a compound, you have it difficult to explain that the form as a motion. Because
that's true.
This is the point. Yeah. In this case, perhaps you can invoke that you are speaking about a proper name, which are more free in this case. Yeah. But be careful of this. Yeah. And what about the semantics, as sve and hund? Yeah. If we have in Latin sve sor, we know this is the woman of our context and family and clan. This fits perfectly. But what about the dog in this case?
Yeah.
Have you an explanation for this, or you have to think about? Yeah.
I have to think about it. Yeah, and I have thought about if he or if sway is the right way of etymologizing the head part. Yeah. But I would need the way to account for the dissimulation. But semantically, yes, I have thought about it, yeah, and I think that this part of the Hecate, the Queen of Troy, may actually be the explanation, but I'm not sure. Also, that sway can mean not just belonging to ourselves, but also separate. The separate belonging here.
What? Excuse me.
Yeah.
What would be the translation you have given?
I have just her own dogs. I've just translated it, her own dogs.
Yeah. Okay.
But it could be separate or dogs of another type. That is dogs separate from another type than those of the traditional hellhounds. It might not be the same type of dog. But yes, I'm sure I need to elaborate a little more on that and think a little more about it.
Because
I agree. Thank you.
Well,
Also, thank you very much. It has been a little bit longer than it was promised, but it was.
So, thank you again. We are about 10-12 minutes late, so I propose that we do what we did before, that we make 25-minute breaks and we can chat about 15:35, maybe 15:40 or something like that. Sorry. 16. 4:10.
Okay.
Sorry.
Ja. Ja. Men jeg synes, det er meget rart, at det er ligesom 30 minutter, at der er lige til overskud. Nogle gange er det 40 eller 50, så bliver det.
Ja. Kan jeg tømme den her kage, og så komme tilbage med den? Eller skal den stå præcis som der?
Nej, øjeblik. Jeg slukker lige.
Hvor er jeg på?